Welcome to Season 3 of Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. I'm Josh Sharfstein, Vice Dean for Public Health Practice and Community Engagement and a former Secretary of Maryland's Health Department. Our goal is to bring scientific evidence and experience to the public health news of the day through informative interviews with scientists, community leaders, policy experts, public health officials, clinicians, and more. If you have ideas or questions for us to cover, please email us at publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
Hi, I'm Lindsay Smith Rogers, producer of Public Health on Call. Today, I speak with Adam Levy, otherwise known as Climate Adam on YouTube. Dr. Levy is a science journalist and communicator whose engaging videos break down the complexity of climate change. We talk about how to talk about this overwhelming topic and some parallels between the challenges of communicating about climate change and the COVID-19 pandemic. Let's listen. Dr. Adam Levy, thank you so much for joining us today. So you are Climate Adam on YouTube. You are a science journalist and communicator with a degree in atmospheric physics. And your mission is to close the gap between research and action. So let's start there and talk about how you started doing YouTube videos around climate change.
Well, I started making YouTube videos. I made my first YouTube video while I was doing my doctorate in atmospheric physics. And one of the things you learn when you're doing a doctorate in atmospheric physics is just how far away the conversation within science is from the conversation we're having in public or in politics about climate change. And that was so frustrating because you're just seeing incredible research being done. And then you're just seeing points being argued which were settled decades and decades ago. And the real straw that broke the camel's back, as it were, for me starting to make videos, I had a conversation in a pub with just a stranger, actually, who really didn't believe in climate change and kind of came up with all this nonsense. And I tried my best based on what I'd been learning to explain what we understood of the science. And to my amazement, he said, "Oh, fair enough. Oh, okay," which I now know is an unusual response. At the time, it was just magical to see someone come round like this. And I thought, well, I want to speak to as many people as possible. And as someone who watched a lot of YouTube videos, it seemed very obvious that making YouTube videos was a great way of speaking to as many people as possible.
And that specific example that you just gave was about sea levels changing, correct? Can you talk through that?
Yeah, so what this guy said was he had a gin and tonic, I think, and there were some ice cubes in the glass. And he pointed out that if the ice cubes melt, the level of the gin and tonic wouldn't go up or go down. And he's quite right about this. But he then said, well, surely that means sea level won't go up or go down when the ice on Earth melts. And that's not true. And the reason that's not true is because there's ice on land. And when that melts, it runs into the ocean. There's also the effect of the ocean heating up. And we don't really notice it when we have a glass of water, but water does expand when it heats up. So as the oceans heat up, that will also cause them to rise.
So there's this gap between what you were seeing in the scientific world and sort of the public discourse that you were trying to fill. But you also really want to have meaningful conversations around this big, complex problem of climate change. It's not just about educating people. It's also about engaging them, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think education just sounds very much like standing at the front of a classroom or on an atop an ivory tower and talking down to people. And that's very much what I hope not to do. I hope to have, I suppose, more human conversations about climate change and make what is an incredibly complex topic more manageable and more approachable for people.
And you've referred to it as climate anxiety, which I really like. Can you talk a little bit about what that means for you?
So for me personally, I think it can mean a number of things. It can have a sense of hopelessness and helplessness, I think, sometimes. So I think this is something we've all maybe experienced in the context of the pandemic as well, just seeing these huge scale events unfolding and feeling like we just can't see an end in sight and we don't know what we can do to make the end come into sight. And that can be especially frustrating, or it has been especially frustrating, when it feels like no one's even talking about it. And for a long time, that's what it's felt like to be a climate scientist. You're looking at all this helplessness and hopelessness, and then you just see the rest of the world carrying on like there's nothing going on. Fortunately, in the last couple of years, that's really started to change thanks to some incredible movements that we've seen around the world. And now climate change is one of the political topics that gets discussed extensively. I still don't know whether I'd say it gets discussed adequately, but at least that conversation is there in a way that it hasn't been before. And that definitely eases my hopelessness quite a bit.
And so, a lot of the videos that you do and a lot of the communicating that you do, because you're also quite active on Twitter and you're a journalist. And so you're trying to have these conversations about climate change and the fact that it's already happening. It's not something that, we can just reverse overnight or that we could stop from happening. Like, it's already happening. And so when you're thinking about the conversations that you want to have with people, who are you envisioning in your mind is your audience? Because, you also talk about, closing the gap between research and action. So are you thinking about, the person in the pub that you're having a conversation with? And then what do you want them to be able to do with that information?
Yeah, I guess the person in the pub is definitely a subcategory of the person I'd like to speak to. It includes, I suppose, anyone who thinks about climate change, either a little or a lot, but isn't really sure what to think and really isn't sure what to do about it. So people who are maybe curious all the way up to very interested, but just have gaps in what they know and what to do. So a lot of my videos are focused on filling in, I suppose, gaps around what we understand. But yeah, I absolutely do try to also explain what we understand about what we can do to stop it, together or individually. And hopefully that helps ease people's hopelessness and helplessness as well. So yeah, and that's something that I'd really like to try and do more within the same videos as well, explaining, okay, well, here's a really serious problem, and if you're so inclined, here are things that can be done about it.
So give us an example. What can we do?
So I think, well, I mentioned it just before, but I think it bears repeating. We've seen over the last few years just how big a difference it can make to turn up the volume of the conversation on climate change. Before, I think politicians and policymakers didn't do anything about it because they could get away with not doing it, or some would say they didn't do anything because there wasn't the public will for it. I think it's very difficult now for policymakers in very many countries to make that claim now, simply because we've made the conversation about climate change so much louder. So purely by talking about climate change, sharing information about climate change, including with people where that conversation is difficult, I think is an invaluable service. And personally, I think it's one of the most valuable things we can do on climate change. And I don't just say that because I make videos about climate change.
And what kind of reception do you get? What kind of feedback do you get from people?
Well, it's a range. So I consider myself very lucky that it's mostly positive. And for me, the most positive things are from people saying something along the lines of, oh, I hadn't thought about this before. Thank you for explaining it. Or, oh, I'd heard something different, and now I get it. The comments that I also quite like are people who are kind of more knowledgeable and are just kind of saying, oh, thank you, and here's some more information. But of course, it's climate change. Of course, I get comments from people saying, oh, of course, this isn't true. Earth temperature's going down. I don't know, whatever untrue scientific statement you can think about climate change, I do occasionally get.
There's a parallel here between outright denial of climate change and perhaps denial of the severity of the consequences of climate change and denial of the severity of the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. So let's unpack that a little bit. How do you think about messaging, and what could we learn from one to maybe apply to the other?
Well, one thing I find interesting is, although the argument in theory should be very different, denying climate change is happening is different from denying it's severe. We often hear these arguments from the exact same people at different times. So, for example, you might hear Donald Trump saying it's going to get colder, or you might hear him saying, oh, but global warming isn't going to be that bad. But these arguments don't really work together, because if it's not happening, why would you need to say it's not that bad? Now, we see exactly the same strategies used for COVID as well, strategies to dismiss it as a real thing, strategies to say it's not that severe, to blame other people. And I think the important thing to remember is that all of these strategies are strategies of delay and deflection. And they're very hard strategies to combat directly. I think what's more important is to amplify and uplift the voices who do actually understand the threat, understand the issue, and so that there's as much accurate, reliable, and honest information out there, rather than instead trying to tackle the misinformation head on, which only serves to amplify it further.
And so let's talk a little bit about, are there specific policy actions right now that you're focused on, or where's the conversation for you at this moment?
So I would say, as someone who comes from science and works as a science journalist, I don't think it's my job to push for particular actions, but rather to inform people about what's happening and about actions that could be taken. I think one of the things I've really seen at the moment is, along with this big rise in the volume of the conversation about climate change, is a lot of information from people who really care about climate change. Before, it felt like most of the misinformation came from people who didn't believe and didn't care about climate change. But now I think there's a lot of misunderstanding from people who really do care and really want to fix it. And to me, it seems incredibly valuable to try and address that misinformation, because these are already people who are incredibly motivated and want to make a difference. And I think if armed with the right information, they can make, hopefully, an even bigger difference.
Is part of that misinformation that people feel like they just can't put a dent in this problem?
I think one of the most common pieces of misinformation I encounter, and I encounter in many different forms, is this sense that it's already too late. There's nothing that can be done. It's much worse than the climate scientists even thought it was going to be. We've already passed some point of no return. And I would say there's no scientific evidence for any of those things. All the scientific evidence we have points to the fact that there is still a huge amount to fight for. And everything we understand about climate change suggests it's not a binary thing. No matter how late it gets, it could always get worse. No matter how bad it gets, it could always get worse. So there's always something to fight for when it comes to climate change.
So you're hopeful?
I definitely am hopeful, especially when I compare the situation now to the situation when I started my doctorate, when no one was talking about it. It looked like we were tracking the worst case scenarios. Now it looks like we have already bent the emissions curve down in some ways. And so whether we'll keep global warming underneath the limits that the international community has agreed upon, I don't know if I feel hopeful about that, but I certainly feel hopeful that we're going to avoid what a few years ago looked like an almost inevitable worst case scenario.
On this podcast, we talked to quite a few scientific communicators and journalists who are communicating around the pandemic right now, which can feel like a bit of a thankless job, which I'm sure is something you can relate to. So what advice do you have for people that are trying to have meaningful conversations around these really big, complex problems?
So I think one of the things I would bear in mind, just from a self-care point of view, is knowing when there is a conversation to be had. Some people aren't in a place for whatever reason where they can have a productive conversation. And it can be very upsetting to talk to people in that situation. And I think it's important to know, okay, me talking to this person right now isn't necessarily going to have a positive effect. But for the conversations you do have, I think making things relatable is the most important thing that I can suggest. And that can take a number of different forms. One can be to just connect it to people and things in people's everyday lives. For climate change, that's especially important because it can seem so huge, so abstract. Climate change is everywhere. And when something is everywhere, it can seem like it's nowhere unless you do this work to localize it. And I also really like to use metaphors when it's difficult to do that, to bring something into someone's life. So when I'm talking about something which might seem quite abstract about how we make energy or about how the climate system works, I try and think of a metaphor that can bring it into someone's life.
Like ice melting in a gin and tonic.
Like ice melting in a gin and tonic, like fizzy drinks. I don't know, getting punched in the face is my favorite one so far.
That's a great video. People need to check that out. Well, thank you so much, Climate Adam, for this conversation and for all that you're doing for climate change. It really is making an impact.
Thank you so much for having me.
Public Health on Call is produced by Josh Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, and Stephanie Desmond. Audio production by Spencer Greer, Niall Owen McCusker, C.N. Oates, and Matthew Martin, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production support from Catherine Ricardo and Neiman Outland. Social media support from Brenda Haggader, Grace Holes Fernandez, and Caroline Wong. Thank you for listening.